Well, we all made it. It's 2022 and we all seem to survive yet another year of all the ups and downs that come along with life, including in this case, a global pandemic and everything else that the world seems to be throwing at us. This next year we have a lot of things that are already in the works, a lot of conversations already going on. Different people have been popping up within our church and, saying that they want to look a little bit more at this thing or that thing, everything from children's ministry to expanding different worship families we have at different homes or commercial locations, whatever it is. So if that's something that you're sitting here wondering what's going on, or you think you might want to get a little bit more involved, it doesn't have to be anything big. It can be something super simple, something you just want to do once, or something that you want to see recurring over and over again. Bring it up to whoever is your home church host or one of the pastors. You can always feel free to contact me if you want, and we want to say yes, to any idea that's brought up, and then we kind of give ourselves permission to fail if it, doesn't pan out. So, anyway, just want to throw that out there. It's a new year. Let's get weird with how we do church. So, without any further ado, let's get into this week's lesson. It is a new year, and because it's a new year, everybody's always talking about New Year's resolutions, right? And, recently there's been a lot of people who've actually, I guess, been kind of doing like the anti-New Year's resolution, saying this year I'm not going to do any resolutions. I'm going to do this. And it's always a little funny to me, just being like the cynic, and because I hear that and I think, well, by you saying this year I don't want to have a resolution, didn't you basically just create a resolution to not have resolutions? Anyway, maybe that's just word games. But either way, we all want to look at self-improvement, how we can improve ourselves or overcome different obstacles in our life, try to shed different habits, maybe get a little bit more in that shape that you were back when you were in your early 20s in college. I do not know if fatherhood is going to let me go back there, but I know I hope to get back maybe a little bit closer in that direction. But everybody wants to look somewhere for self-improvement, and that the exact same thing can be said when people look at their relationship with the Bible. People tend to look at things in the Bible and, see all kinds of examples of, phrases and verses and stories that they kind of superimpose themselves into, and then say, you know what, that feels motivational to me. I feel like maybe I can be a stronger person there. But is that kind of a misread of what we see in the Bible? Here in a second, you guys are going to read an excerpt out of a very popular story that I know that you've read, probably time and time again. And that's the story of David and Goliath. And you're not going to read the whole thing, but just read this one little excerpt in there. And what I want you to do is I want you to look at David standing up against this giant and see how he responds. See where he attributes all of his strength, his power, and who he gives credit to for the victory that he was going to achieve. So take a moment in your groups and just kind of pour over that and see how that doesn't contrast with maybe some of the messages we see in our world today about self-empowerment, about how you can overcome and you can be the strength and you can be the victory. See how David stands up against a giant in his life. There's a funny little comic that I saw one time. I guess it'd really be more of a meme that was printed on like a coffee cup, and it basically had some scene that you would typically see in like Sunday school material, probably from like the 70s or something. And it had David with his sling, and it had Goliath, and it had labels over David and Goliath. And Goliath, it had a label that said Goliath. And over David, it had a label that said not you. And, at first I had to think about exactly what it was talking about, but, it was kind of getting to the fact that we tend to superimpose ourselves into these people that we read in the Bible because it helps us to be able to think that, well, if this individual can overcome, maybe I can overcome. Maybe I can, beat the odds. Maybe I can stand up against whatever forces out there in this world are going to stand up against me. But that maybe is kind of taking the wrong lesson out of the Bible, because the Bible is about self-empowerment. What you read just now out of this story about David and Goliath is that, David gives all the glory for what he achieves to God. He attributes all of his strength and everything he has to God working through him. And so this meme that I was referring to is really looking at David and saying it's not about David being you. It's about, in a lot of ways, David being Jesus Christ. Because think about that for a second. David basically gave all the credit, all the glory for everything that he did to God. And so in a very real sense, it wasn't him standing up against Goliath. It was God standing up against Goliath. And the exact same thing can be said about our own lives. We are just beings full of weaknesses, right? I mean, I would love to be able to say that I can achieve all things. And if you think of a Bible verse when I say that, we'll get there. But the reality is that, I mean, just calling a spade, I'm probably never going to play for the Lakers, both because of my fitness and because of my, raging height of 5'6", I'll say on a good day. There's certain things I'm just simply never going to be able to do. But yet, we look in the Bible and we do see verses that you'll read here in a second, Philippians 4:12 through 13. You read in 13 where it says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. That's true, but that's not saying that you can sit here and reach an all-time high, that you can sit here and bench press more than you've ever benched in the past, or that you can beat that habit because of Christ. It's saying that God has placed you in a certain position in life. He has given you certain circumstances. He has given you a calling, a mission, a purpose. And for achieving that purpose, nothing can stand up against what God has ordained. If God has put you in a position to be able to witness to somebody, to do something great for the kingdom, nothing's going to stand in its way. So I'm going to pause right there, and in a second, you guys are going to read that excerpt from Philippians, and I want you to talk about that. What does it mean to be able to do all things through Christ? What are these all things that Paul is talking about, and how does that translate to our lives today? It's important for us to keep in mind that, God isn't calling us necessarily to be like an NBA all-star. He's not calling us to be the best artist in the world, the best writer in the world, or whatever it is that we do. God has, a higher calling for us. And some of the skills that we have may be a part of that. If we have artistic skills, athletic skills, if we have business skills, these may be things that God is going to use as instruments to achieve His plan. But ultimately, that's the goal, His plan. Not whatever our plan is, not whatever we want out of our life and what we want to be like and what we want to look like, but what God wants to be able to accomplish. And He wants to be able to use you. The thing that's funny is that, people so often will end up pulling back from that because they feel like, what God has called them to do is something that they can't control. God called me to start a church. God called me to go out and go on a mission trip. He called me to work in the lives of individual people that I meet, to be a teacher, to be a worship family host, whatever it is. I don't feel like I don't feel like I can do this. But exercise, I feel like I can do that. Practice more at my instruments, I feel like I can do that. You see, quickly we start, framing out our lives in terms of what we can control and what we can't control, and we tend to gravitate towards those things we can't control. I think that's why, even as Christians, we end up getting caught up so much in this whole, I got to be better, I got to be healthier, I got to be stronger, I got to be smarter, I got to be more popular, whatever it is. But the reality is that there's this other side of life that's actually way more important, and that's what God has called us to do. God has called us here and put us here on this earth for a reason. And it's in that reason that we can be strong. Nothing can stand against us if God has called us to do something, no matter what that thing may be. So as we're going and doing that, because we can't control it, it means we're forced with this very uncomfortable situation. We may have weaknesses. We may have things just like Moses, just like, all these other individuals in the Bible who were reluctant to take on their calling. We may have things that cause us, to pause, to say, God, maybe you got the wrong guy or the wrong girl. Maybe I'm not the person who can actually do this. I know you put that person in my life that I see every single day, but I'm not good about talking about my faith, I know that maybe, I sit here and, I'm passionate about kids, and I want to help out with, kids ministry or something like that. But, I just don't know if I have the energy for that, God, so maybe you got the wrong person. It's just not right for me right now. Well, in reality, what we see is that every person in the Bible that God uses has a very good reason to not do what they ended up doing, but yet they did. If that was a little confusing, then you're going to read here in a second something that Paul says in 2 Corinthians. He talks about actually embracing your weakness, and in your weakness being able to say, I'm strong because I recognize where I'm weak. That may sound confusing, but it actually makes a lot of sense. I mean, we find God oftentimes when we are at our weakest point, when we can't get any lower. when we can't rely on anything else, including ourselves, we tend to rely on God. And that's why you're going to see Paul here in a moment talk about embracing his weakness, and in that weakness, in fact, being strong. Whenever I've heard somebody talk about, ministry in particular, whether that's personal ministry or church ministry or some kind of organizational ministry, and then express some sort of reluctance, more often than not, there's actually a legitimate reason why they're reluctant. Maybe they don't have the energy. Maybe it is a bad time of life. Maybe, they don't have all the necessary skills, or they don't know the full plan ahead of time. But, there's a phrase that I've caught myself saying more and more and more often these days, and that's that there will always be a reason to not do something. There's always going to be a legitimate reason to not put your hand up and say, God, I'll go do it. There's always going to be a reason to say that, I can't do a Bible study. There's always going to be a reason to say, I can't, sit here and get involved in this ministry or that ministry, or I can't do this church thing. I can't be a worship family host. There's always going to be something that is a very legitimate reason to not do something that God has called you to do. That's how the fallen world works. In reality, at some point in time, we're going to have to step out on faith. If we're going to do what God has called us to do, we're going to have to sit here and be comfortable saying, I don't have all the answers. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know the plan. I don't know if it's the best time for me. I don't know if I have the energy for it. But God, I know this is what you've called me to do. I can feel that you're pulling on my heart. And so I'm going to trust you. I'm going to sit here and not get hung up on my weaknesses, and instead I'm going to rely on your strength in my life. This is something that all of us have to struggle with in some way, shape, or form, often, multiple times, in our lives, multiple times a year, a month, a day. We all struggle with these feelings. But what you're going to need to think about this year, and again, whether you talk about doing something in the church formally, whether you talk about doing something outside the church in a Bible study group, whether you talk about doing something just, interacting with people in your lives that clearly God has placed there, you're going to have to look and at some point in time be willing to take your weaknesses and put them aside and say, I'm going to let God take this one. I'm going to trust that He tells me what to say. I'm going to trust that He gives me the time management skills. I've got to trust that He's going to give me the energy, whatever that is. I can tell you right now, the way ministry works in a fallen world, whether it's personal or whether it's corporate, is it's not easy. That's how it works. And oftentimes that's how you can tell you're actually doing it right, is if it doesn't seem easy. But I have good news. The fact that it's not easy doesn't mean it's not going to be rewarding. It doesn't mean it's not going to be a blast. It doesn't mean that it's not going to have its messiness, but it also doesn't mean that it's not going to be something that you end up looking back on and saying, you know what? It was totally worth the price of everything I had to spend doing it. And so what is that thing? What's your New Year's resolution? What is God calling you to do that you can use as something to demonstrate that you're willing to let go of your own strengths and weaknesses and instead let God take the reins and guide your life? That's our lesson. I hope you guys have a wonderful beginning of the year 2022. Hopefully nobody got a little bit too excited on New Year's Eve and we're all recovered from whatever we did. And once again, until we can meet again, God bless.